Hello, and welcome to VOW, Voices of Wisdom, the show that might not be for everybody, but everybody needs to watch this show, and I'm your host, Brenda Simmons. April 19th, 1989, the Central Park Jogger case involved an assault and rape that took place in New York City's Central Park. The victim was Trisha Meili. 5 juvenile black males were tried and convicted for the crime. The convictions were vacated in 2002 when another man claimed to have committed the crime alone, and DNA evidence confirmed his involvement in the rape. Today I have in my show a journalist who covered the internationally known Central Park Jogger rape case for 4 months in the news and got an exclusive story with the doctors and the nurses who cared for the victim. Today I have on my show Dr. Natalie Byfield. How are you, darling?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Yes. First, I'd like you to just tell us a little bit about your background. I know right now you are a professor at St. John's University.
Yes, I teach sociology at St. John's University at the Queens campus.
And you've also taught in sociology and communications. That's been your field you've taught in?
I've also taught in communications. I taught in communications at Long Island University out here at Southampton when the campus was here, and I also taught at Fordham University.
Okay, and you also have a doctor's degree?
Yeah, my doctorate is in sociology.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And also I have here you are visiting Research Fellow, Research Evaluation Center in John Jay College as well?
I am working on a project that involves other researchers at John Jay College for Criminal Justice, their Research Evaluation Center.
Okay,
yes.
So let's get into talking about your book. And the name of your book is?
The name of the book is Savage Portrayals, Race, Media, and the Central Park Jogger Story.
And obviously you are writing this story because you were involved with...
I'm writing it because I was involved in the story, but I'm also applying a sociological analysis of the case, the media coverage of the case, and the social context in which the case occurred.
And for those people who really don't remember the case, or could you give us a little bit of background about the case that occurred back in '89?
As you said, it was April 19th of 1989, and the young woman, she was 27 years old at the time. She was an investment banker working for Salomon Brothers, which I believe is now defunct. It doesn't exist anymore. It was one of the big investment banking firms on Wall Street, and she had a habit after work of jogging. So around 10 p.m. at night, she went for a run. It was a pretty customary run. It was her habit that took her through the Upper East Side area where she lived and into Central Park across the 102nd Street transverse. And this is where she was attacked.
So as we looked into the story, as I did my little research, we find out that there were 5 young men that were arrested and charged at that time for this particular rape case.
Yes, well, she was attacked, they believe, sometime after 10 or around that time. And she was left for dead, basically, because she was badly beaten, very badly beaten about the head and face. And she had bled out about 50 to 75% of her blood. And passersby found her in the bushes around 1:30 in the morning.
Okay.
So she was found in the morning of April 20th, early in the morning of April 20th. But on April 19th also, there'd been a group of young teens collecting around the entrance of the park, around 110th Street and Central Park. And the newspaper accounts tell us that there were anywhere from 30 to 50 of these teens gathering, and they went into the park, and the account that reporters like myself got from the police was that they broke into smaller groups and ran through the park and were harassing, annoying, attacking others. So various levels of harassment or assault took place in the park that day. Now, somewhere along the way, the police decided that whoever the teens involved in these other harassments, assaults, were all that activity culminated in the attack on the jogger. So during the evening, as people were being harassed in the park, assaulted in the park, and reporting this to the police were also picking up teenagers.
Okay.
And they were going about the place looking for teenagers who they believed were involved, and who some of the teens that they had already picked up were identifying as being involved. Whether this is true or not, we don't know.
Right,
We
right.
just know that some teens were identifying other teens because they were being pressured basically to say who was involved with them in this kind of activity in the park. And I'm deliberately not giving a name to the type of activity because we don't really know. I don't believe we really understand what happened in the park that day.
Right.
And the long and short of it is that the police, though, did believe that whatever these teens were involved in culminated in the attack on the jogger. And as a result of that, some of the teens who had been picked up for the assaults that they had heard about earlier were now being questioned about the attack on the jogger. So these two things came together.
Right, right. So the other thing, which I think was, you made it very clear, was the timing of all of this. Possibly, or factually, they were arrested and in custody, and perhaps maybe assumed that they were involved. Or how do you, am I getting that wrong?
Some of the teens were picked up after the time, or close to the time that the woman was attacked.
Okay.
So this became one of the issues that came up later. That there would not have been enough time for them to have done all the things they were accused of doing, and rape the jogger and get back over to another area to have been picked up by the police. But these were some of the things that came up later. The timing of it became an issue when the new evidence materialized in 2002, basically when this other person stepped forward and said that he alone attacked the jogger.
Right. And even in my research, they talked about even how they questioned the young boys and how that whole process. Do you want to comment on even that whole process, or maybe what you've heard or what you've heard, in the reports about that whole process, even afterwards, what they've reported about that process?
Essentially, what seems to have taken place is cases of false confessions.
Okay.
Where the pressure that they were very young, and this is the thing to keep in mind. They were very, very young.
And their ages was like 14, 16?
In that range.
In that range, right?
And they were being told by the police that, well, if they identified someone else or told what this other person did, then they could go home. When they were tricked.
Okay.
They were tricked into the confessions. They were coerced into the confessions. So the confessions are really problematic. The bulk of my work on this is not necessarily around the false confessions, because it's a case of false confessions,
right.
but around how the media handled the case.
Okay, let's get into talking about that. How do you portray that, as that being an issue?
Well, for me, there's a long history within the mainstream media of negative portrayal of African Americans in general, but particularly black males. So within the context of this long history, this case occurs. In addition to that, part of what we had taking place in our society at that time was this war on drugs. Now, the war on drugs has continued, but I'm bringing it up to say that the war on drugs really contributed to how people perceived African-American males, particularly young African-American males, because they were being identified as the problem in the war on drugs that had been gearing up and developing steam with a number of federal administrations beginning in the Nixon years. So by the time we get to the 1980s, more and more young black males are being associated with criminality as a result of this war on drugs, violence and criminality. So it didn't seem like a big leap in terms of mainstream constructions to imagine that, well, they did this.
Right, right, right. So you're basically saying that the perception of the media has a lot to do with even what we're dealing with even today.
The media perception, the perceptions of the people who create media content.
Say that again. I think that's key.
The perceptions of the people who create media content have a lot to do with how the stories are created and how they're delivered to the audiences. And of course, they affect audience perceptions. So
do they do that because they want more entertainment? They do that because it's more exciting, they get more ratings? You know, what is behind all that, you think?
Well, the structure of media in New York City, one of the things you have to keep in mind about that structure is the competition and the intense competition.
Oh, you're right.
So the intense competition certainly does promote sensationalism. And then in a case like this one, where you have an interracial rape, or what's perceived as an interracial rape, it turned out to be that, but with the evidence that was being presented by the police, what we have was this evidence of an interracial rape. It's going to attract a lot of attention. And it's not just going to attract a lot of attention, but the perceptions of the people who create media content, their ideas about interracial rape certainly will apply to the way they cover the stories. So this is part of what you're contending with. You're contending with the competition, which promotes sensationalism. And it was a case of interracial rape. So certainly that would be sensationalized some more. So you start to see how it could develop and build into this huge story that we had back in the spring of 1989.
You know, it's funny, you hit something for me just now when you said that. It's the people behind. I'm always looking at the media, what I see on TV, but obviously it has to be the people behind it that's actually putting that out there, you know, and that's something to think about for me, you know, to me is even a deeper issue than just portraying, you know, African Americans male on television. It's just more to it than that to me now that you said that.
And I think it's a very complex issue because I covered the story, and I'm an African American female who covered the story. So yes, I'm saying the people behind it, myself included, but the structures involved with creating the stories makes it really difficult and I'm going to say it in a number of ways. One, for independent voices, but not just independent voices, for a voice that doesn't follow the narrative that's been accepted now by those who are in charge. And one of the critical complaints about the coverage in this story is that they settled on a narrative based on the story presented by the police. And this narrative that was settled on was not challenged. And they wouldn't allow it to be challenged, even in the process of us doing our work. So for instance, in the research that I did on the coverage, I pulled a few hundred articles and looked at them and assessed them for a variety of things. And one of the things I noticed is that maybe only 14 articles in the sample of 251 that I used the term alleged.
Really?
So the audience wasn't even being given the option of considering their possible innocence.
And see, that alone, it might be a minor thing to maybe the natural people would maybe not think about, but when you think about that, that's significant.
The term alleged was rarely used. Now, in the context of all of the people involved with creating the content for this story, everyone is not in the same position. I was a young, lowly reporter, but I know there was a columnist at the Times who heavily criticized the media during the coverage and said, "What are you doing?
Really?
This is insane."
Really?
But there were no breaks on this one. There were absolutely no breaks on this one.
I know I've heard sometime where, you know, it's almost like to save face. They can't find the person who did it, so they got to get somebody, because, I mean, after all, they got to show that they're doing their job, whether it be the police, the investigators, or whoever. So how do you feel about that? Is that something that you sensed in New York City, or is that just my craziness?
I think there was tremendous pressure on the police to come up with the guilty parties.
And who's pressuring them?
I think some of it is political, because if you think of the context of New York City at the time, it's the late 1980s. We had a mayoral campaign in which the first serious African-American candidate for mayor was just getting going. So that was part of the backdrop. Then we also had a city that was in the midst of experiencing a lot of street violence as a result of the crack cocaine trade. So there was all this political pressure to address this.
And usually that's the root of a lot of it too, when it comes to political era, and what the flavor of it, when it's a political intensity of, you know, is the voting going on, or an election going on, then you would have that kind of pressure. I remember, I was trying to remember this detective story that I wrote, I researched about this Detective Reyes statement. I don't know if you remember. It says, inside the 20th precinct that day, this gentleman, he said, in 25 years on the job, I took 1,000 confessions and 3,000 homicides. Out of all the bad guys I've talked to across the table, this one was the top 5 lunatics, meaning the guy that they finally did arrest. And we would talk a little bit about that the 5 gentlemen served maybe up to 10 years, but then they found that there wasn't the ones who did the crime. It was one guy. And this is what this guy is saying. This guy was a lunatic. But for these young boys to serve that much time, and then to have, you know, this guy come up to say his confession, I guess what I'm trying to also say is that they didn't do their homework. And it's almost they didn't choose to do their homework.
They wanted a quick solution, and it was easy for people to believe. Because of the particular history of this country, but because of the particular racial history of this country, it was easy for people to believe that this group of young black teens who had never been in trouble before were going to just be involved in the rape of this woman.
You know, a lot of people don't want to talk about this, but would I be crazy to say that this even goes all the way back from slavery, this whole perception?
The perception of black males having a propensity to rape certainly comes out of particularly the period right after slavery. During that period, the Reconstruction era, the late 19th century, we had an increase in lynchings. And oftentimes the reasons given for the lynchings of black males was that the black male had been involved in a rape. And a very famous journalist from that era, Ida Wells Barnett, investigated a lot of these assumed rapes that led to the lynchings, and discovered that they weren't what they appeared to be. Sometimes they were actually the men and women, the black men and the white women had been involved in relationships, intimate relationships, but it wasn't acceptable. And the only way to save the honor of the white female was to say that she was raped. So you have this history of this label being assigned to black men during this period in time, but what's particular about the period, and I think very interesting about the period, is that it is the period right after slavery when there is much more competition among blacks and whites because blacks are now free and there's much more labor competition.
Okay.
So you start to get this heavy denigration of black males and this advancement in the popular culture about black males, as the term was the black beast rapist. And this is something that's carried on over time. So you had this coming out of the late 19th century. Historians have documented this. Some people will remember, particularly people who are interested in film will remember Birth of a Nation,
Right.
where this becomes the undercurrent in this film also. And it promotes it promotes again the fear of the black male as a rapist. So it's when you have this historical background as part of the context for how black males are perceived, it almost becomes it becomes relatively easy to make that leap and to say that these young, and the thing to keep in mind, because I can't stress enough that these were young kids.
Yes.
One of the ones picked up for question was 13. I mean,
Wow.
so we had very young black and Latino males being picked up for questioning, and of course, the police deciding to arrest and prosecute the 5 or 6 of them. So you have this taking place in this period now when the Central Park Jogger incident happened. The part of what's new about it is that the mainstream is willing to say that young black males are also just as dangerous as adult black males. So it's something that's really, in some ways, a turning point for us, because we have this history of black men in general being labeled as rapists.
Right.
And then we move through time, and in part, as I mentioned before, because of the war on drugs and the involvement of young black and Latino males in the crack and cocaine trade, you have, and they were not the only ones involved, but the violence during that period that was not just related to the crack and cocaine trade, but the society, youth involvement in violence was growing tremendously during this period. And the Surgeon General at the time, Satcher, did a whole study on this and said that this is not race, and there is no racial association that should be made here, because youth violence was increasing in general across the board. But you have also during this period the war on drugs that helps people to label young black males, young Latino males as the ones. They become the face of youth violence.
Exactly.
So the case occurs, the incident, the Central Park Jogger incident occurs during this time period. And within the context of the time period, it became easy for them to make that leap and say, well, these kids, because they were children.
Yes.
These children, they did it.
Children. And you know, even when you're talking, I'm thinking about now even start bringing in the youth being incarcerated. And then that whole stigma is a whole nother story. We can have another show on, particularly about even the stigma of them being incarcerated, because that now, after they're incarcerated, they come out, it's hard to find a job. You know, there's a whole snowball effect that happens with that.
There's a very important and interesting study that was done on this. And the researcher, her name's Diva Pager, and she found that she did the study in which groups of blacks and whites were given comparable resumes and comparable backgrounds and sent out to find jobs. And what they discovered was that it was easier for a white male with a record to get a job than a black male without a record.
Okay.
So the construction and the construction or the creation of this image of black males has had repercussions over time. And this relatively new formulation that targets primarily the younger Black and Latino males, again, has repercussions. I think, for me, I think the Trayvon Martin case is a byproduct of this.
Absolutely.
Where the impression and the belief that young Black and Latino males are so dangerous.
With some Skittles and some iced tea.
So dangerous that just their presence requires you to defend yourself.
Right. That's yeah. So, this book will be out, hopefully.
It'll be out next year.
Next year.
Yeah.
And the title again?
The title is Savage Portrayals, Race, Media, and the Central Park Jogger Story.
So I will definitely have to have you back.
I would love to be back.
Meantime, I just want to, before I leave, I want to just say a few quotes from some of your students, because I think it's very important as an African American, even just as a teacher or professor alone, it's important how you conduct your classroom. You know, and obviously, you know, from my conversation with you, I know that you conduct your classroom different than perhaps, I shouldn't say, I'm being judgmental maybe a little because I've gone through college and I've had some professors who've been a little challenging. But I just want to read a few quotes. This one says, I took global communications with Dr. Byfield in fall of 2010, and she's a great professor. You will learn a great deal, and she had much experience outside the classroom as well. Highly recommended her class. She's a great professor. Best sociology teacher I ever had thus far. Passionate and takes a lot of interest in your work. A true college professor. Interesting and educational course. She's very educated, organized, rational, and a great professional overall. Professor overall. Excellent class. She is very intelligent. Her delivery is engaging and interactive. We are asked to read, but never particularly necessarily because she simplifies the text material. She always uses plenty of historical evidence and ties into current evidence. She grades fairly and was a joy to have. I highly recommend her. The last one I thought was the best one. The most enlightening class I ever taken at St. John's University, point blank.
Oh, that's nice.
Thank you, Dr. Byfield, for being on my show.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm going to have you back.
Okay, great.
This has been Val, Voices of Wisdom, and have a wonderful day.